Hello, this is Dr. Anthony Delmond. In this lecture, we're going to talk about prospecting. We're going to go through the prospecting process itself. We're going to talk about different prospecting methods that you can use. We're going to discuss why it's important, and then we're going to go through some tips for prospecting that can improve your likelihood of success. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify the four general seller-buyer relationships. That's what we're going to cover first. You should be able to talk about how and why and even when prospecting occurs, and discuss a range of prospecting methods along with their appropriate use. You should be able to determine which prospecting method is best to use in each buyer-seller scenario. You should understand the importance of continuously prospecting. So this is not a process that happens just at the beginning of your sales career. This is something that you continue to do throughout, and you should know why. You should be able to describe the process of qualifying prospects and the significance of that, why it's important, and also discuss where it falls within the sales process. So prospecting is the first step of establishing a relationship between the salesperson and a potential buyer. We call potential buyers prospects, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to find and qualify prospective customers. Prospecting involves finding potential customers, collecting information about those customers, and determining the likelihood that they'll become a real customer at the end of the day. Collecting information is a pretty complex topic. We're not going to go through all of it here, but you can kind of see from previous lectures and the future what kind of information and why you want to collect information at all. So marketing departments, separately from sales, are responsible for portions of the prospecting process, specifically lead generation. Lead generation is where you determine a list of people who might become good prospects for making a sales call. Sometimes businesses do this internally by having a team that looks for groups and target demographics to try and sell to, and other companies will go to external consultants and have leads generated outside the company. And once those leads are established, then the marketing department will send them along to the sales reps. The long-run goal of any salesperson is to make a sale. Prospecting is not to make a sale. Prospecting is to find a prospect that you can have a likely success with in a sales presentation. It's one of those crucial steps, but usually salespeople don't like this step. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why as we go through. There are four main parts of prospecting, the prospecting process. The first is to generate or acquire leads. As I said, that oftentimes happens in the marketing department, whether they hire it out or do it internally. Next is to gather information. You're going to gather information about the prospect's needs, the prospect's wants, and then some personal or demographic information about those prospects. All of that's going to go in a file, essentially, so that you can go back and look at the information later when you're actually making the sales call. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to qualify the prospect. This is where you're going to determine whether they have the budget, the need, and the real likelihood of making a purchase. And then once you've decided that they are a good qualified prospect, you're going to schedule the sales call. This is what happens in the prospecting process. The gathering information, qualifying, and scheduling section all happen together. The generation of leads happens prior to all of that. And you might gather some information while you're acquiring leads as well, depending on how established your leads are. Prospecting usually starts with leads. We'll talk about some examples of prospecting methods where we don't have leads in advance, but typically you're going to start with a list of people who we don't know too much information about, but they're part of a target demographic that is likely to be interested in the product. For example, if you're selling lawnmowers, this might be people who own their own yards. Not a lot of information there, but at least it's something, it's a lead. They might have an interest in the product. Another would be if you're looking at selling something that is primarily used by the elderly, for example, walkers, then you would want to choose your leads based on age. During the prospecting phase, the sales staff is going to attempt to narrow that list into qualified prospects, which means that they are not only people who fit this target demographic, but they also meet some other key requirements for being a willing buyer. Like I said, some businesses find leads through outside sources. In a lot of businesses, salespeople have to find their own leads. This is where you go to colleagues, other people you work with, clients. So maybe you'll be looking for referrals from current buyers, current customers, or you could go and try and make those other professional connections and find some leads there. There are 4 main buyer-seller relationship types, and we need to talk about this because each one has its own associated presentation styles and prospecting styles. So B2B, this is business to business. When a business is selling to another business or buying from another business and there aren't customers involved, these are just sort of internal interactions. And we often have very impersonal interactions. This sometimes is done in an automated way, but a lot of times you still have a sales representative selling to a big business. The next is the business to customer relationship. This is where businesses are selling to end users. Retail is a good example of this. This is what we're commonly used to as the customers. But there's also customers to business. This is becoming a lot more common because people are going and selling their services more and more to businesses as consultants, doing freelance. And then we even have something where we have customer-to-customer relations. Again, growing in popularity. If you think about the internet and being able to buy from individual online retailers, these are going to be private retailers. People are selling the things that they make themselves. It's a little bit closer to this customer-to-customer model. But we also see a lot of private resellers purchasing products and then giving a markup to it and selling it to other customers. So this is a growing area. It didn't used to be that we had a lot of customer-to-business or customer-to-customer relations, but we have a lot of those relationships now. Again, different business models are going to utilize different prospecting methods, and we'll kind of touch on that as we go through. In addition to the customer-seller relations, products themselves, the target audience, and a lot of other factors determine the appropriate prospecting method. We're going to consider a handful of prospecting methods here, but it's by no means all of them. The ones we're going to focus on are cold calling and cold canvassing. We'll talk about warm calling and warm canvassing as well. Email and mail, telemarketing, which encompasses some of those others. Telemarketing can include cold calling, but it's a lot more than that. We'll talk about social selling. That's really common now in the customer to business and customer to customer world. Networking is important, working to become an expert in your field, and then referrals and trying to gain access to existing customers, also important prospecting methods. All right, first one we're going to go through is cold calling and cold canvassing. Cold is a term that's given to the prospecting method where you haven't warned somebody that you're going to contact them. We've all had cold calls. This is somebody calling you on the phone. You've never talked to them before, and they're going to try and sell you a product. It's personal because you're connecting directly with someone, but you don't have really any knowledge of what their interest is in the product. You might just have a lead which says that they are maybe elderly and you're trying to sell them a rascal. Obviously, not a lot to go on. So your job is a little bit more work. It's calling and prospecting through an unsolicited call. They don't plan on it. They don't necessarily want it. Cold canvassing, however, is similar, but it's when the prospecting happens in person rather than over a call. So this is when somebody shows up at your door and they're trying to sell you a product. These both depend on a law of large numbers to be profitable, because in order to be successful, you need to make sure you go to a lot of people. You're going to be unsuccessful on most of your cold calls and cold canvassing efforts, so you need to have a lot of them to be successful. Generally, salespeople hate cold calling and cold canvassing because you get repeatedly rejected and it doesn't feel very good. Personally, I like this approach because it is easy to separate yourself from the fear of rejection because you know you're going to be rejected many, many times. So it's not as personal, it's just routine. A lot of salespeople develop an aversion to cold calling. Cold calling more than cold canvassing. This is called call reluctance. It's very common, and businesses have to spend a lot of time, energy, and money helping salespeople work past this call reluctance that people get into a rut with this. A lot of times salespeople overestimate the amount of cold calls that they do because they have such reluctance. Jim Blount wrote a book and discusses this in detail, talking about the fact that when he watched people make cold calls and they hadn't in a long time, they overestimated the numbers of calls they were actually making and the number of connections they were actually making because it was such a release to actually be doing any of them. There is a way to reduce call reluctance and reduce that element of surprise for the prospect, and that is to warn them ahead of time, to prime them. And I say warn with an N, but what you're doing is you're making it a warm with an M call, because the salesperson has let them know ahead of time or been contacted previously so that the buyer knows that the call is coming. Warm calls are a lot easier because prospects typically know they're coming, and they've typically given some indication that they want those calls to come. Cold canvassing and warm canvassing are really expensive, probably the most expensive prospecting methods because they require a lot of manpower, time, and effort to be profitable. If you're going door to door, you can only sell to one person at a time. And this means to be successful, you need to go to tons of houses. And for the business to be successful, you need a lot of salespeople to do this, and you need to pay them a lot of money to only have really quick touches with clients. Cold calling is quicker because you don't have to walk. There's no transportation time. You don't have to worry about distance between potential buyers, but it's not as personable because you're not in person with them. So cold canvassing can be useful. It's not quite as common as it used to be, but it's still it's very expensive. All right, looking at the time, I think we're going to stop there and come back and talk about prospecting by mail.